Hello and welcome to Battling with Business with me, Gareth Tennant.
And me, Chris Kitchener.
Today we're talking about the war game. We, at the beginning of the last podcast, before we started recording, and that was the episode on Nelson, got talking about this other podcast, the war game, that we'd both listened to, and had some really interesting conversations and decided that that would probably be a really interesting thing to explore as an episode in itself.
Exactly. And the reason why I said about its university time is because I drove with my son to Cardiff to go look at the university there. And from there, and you can just hear in my voice, I'm just coming towards the end of a rather nasty cold. Of course, what would you do when you have a cold and you've driven to Cardiff? We then drove to North Wales to go climbing the Nantar Ridge. That's a different story for another time. But the reason why I'm telling you that is because we had a lot of time in the car and we listened to these episodes back to back. And what was really interesting was, I think my son, who's 18 and a half, his dad saying we should listen to this thing called the war game. And I think he thought, well, fine, I suppose so. He's looking to do politics. And as we went through it, what was really interesting was it is an incredibly easy listen.
Yeah.
And it is about as exciting as you can imagine. So that's what brought this to my attention. And it turned out when I've spoken to you, you'd listened to it earlier.
Yeah.
But I'll take a step back about what is this podcast, because frankly, I think we've broken all the rules. We're talking about one podcast in another podcast. So let's go back to the beginning and talk about it. The podcast is called The War Game. And I say that because you should absolutely go and download it. It is fantastic. 5-part series that was released in June of this year. So it's actually very new and very relevant. And it was produced by Sky News and Tortoise Media to give it its proper attribution. It's presented by Deborah Haynes, who's the Sky News security and defense editor. And she is sort of the host, and she overlays some information on top of it to explain things and introduce things. But fundamentally, it is a war game. And the reason why it was sort of got me doubly excited is we, in a relatively recent episode, talked about red teaming and wargaming. And we spent a whole 10 minutes trying to demonstrate what a war game might sound like. And I suspect we did a terrible job. It turns out you need 5 hours and the right people to do it justice. And this absolutely does it justice. So,
well, I think what's quite interesting as well is we tried to, in the episode we did with Mike Harvey, where we looked at wargaming and different types of games generally and how they can be useful in the workplace, how they can be useful for leadership development, decision development, red teaming plans, all that kind of stuff. I think we gave the impression that a lot of war games are everybody crowded around a board or a map, and they don't have to be. And I think this particular war game that they played was more immersive sort of character war game.
Absolutely. It's one kind of war game.
It is. So you've got various people in various rooms playing different actors, interacting with the other people in their room, without wanting to sort of steal your thunder about what this particular war game was about. What that allows is you can create those separations between discussions that one group of people might have and another group of people might have. And I ran a war game quite similar to this, based on the game Risk. You know the game Risk, where you roll dice?
Yep, Kamchatka Peninsula
is
the place to go. Or Australia.
Take Australia.
They'll
and
never get you.
Exactly. There. Yeah. So what I effectively did was got 3 board games, the same game of Risk, in 3 different rooms. And then using a chat function, I had 2 people who were playing against each other in one room, and they weren't allowed to make decisions. They were only allowed to move pieces based on what they were told to do. But there was time pressure. Then I had 2 groups, the red team and the blue team, in different rooms, talking about what they thought was happening and they had to replicate on their board what they were being told was happening. And so it created that additional friction. And we played that out over 3 or 4 hours, and it brought out lots of really interesting lessons about communication, about groupthink, about decision making under pressure, about where you have to apply initiative, because at several times throughout this game, the communication on both teams broke down to a point where the people actually playing, where they're facing off against the opposition and they're not allowed to make decisions, were forced into a position where they had to make decisions because the stuff that was coming from higher, if you like, was gobbledygook because they had no idea what was happening. So a really interesting way of taking a really simple game and playing it from...
Well, I still think the challenge is that when we talk theoretically about war games, it's difficult for people to sort of get their heads around it. And there's almost a risk that I can't put myself in the middle of it. Why would I be playing Risk? Let's get back to the war game, because the whole point about this was, and there were various reasons why they were playing this war game, but the whole point was this particular podcast simulated a scenario in which Russia launches a multi-domain attack on the UK, i.e. cyber, missiles, political, whole host of those things. And they were challenging a fictional British government formed by real-life former ministers. So what was really interesting, and it adds to the drama because these are experts in their field, there was Sir Ben Wallace, who was a previous Minister of Defence, Jack Straw, who was a previous
Foreign
Secretary, as well as a Home Secretary, I think, Amber Rudd, and a number of other people. So this was not random people. And actually, this is where I think it makes it easy to make a parallel. These were people who were experts in international relations and were living life. Now, before we go into it, here's how I wanted to sort of break down how we might talk about things today. So the first one is I want to talk about actually the war game itself and why it was an excellent example of red teaming. And again, we're not going to push this point. I think we think red teaming is valuable. All I'm going to say is assume you can do this with scenarios that you would work on in business as well as military. That's not what today is about. Actually, it's more just to sort of enjoy what happened and learn from it. The second thing, which I think was fascinating and surprising, was what the war game illustrated in terms of leadership and decision making. And to give you a sense of this, even though everyone at the table knew it was a game, there's a point at which two of the players start arguing with one another over broader political issues, which makes you realize that they were truly engaged in this game and it wasn't this fake weird thing. And there are other aspects as well. So in terms of decision making, there's a point at which they go for tea and Ben Wallace says, bloody hell, this is all happening too quickly, which I thought again was really interesting. So we'll talk about that. And then the last bit, because it's our podcast and we can, listen, many of us live in the United Kingdom, or at least are familiar with the United Kingdom. In fact, I know we have many of our listeners in the United States. I think it's about 50% of our listeners in the US. Actually, the topic they were discussing around military strategy and international politics was fascinating. And we'll talk a bit about how that revealed itself in the podcast.
Yeah.
But there's a point at which, just for fun, and because we can, the nuclear deterrent. And it was so interesting how people talked about the nuclear deterrent and what it was for. And again, there was a big old argument inside the podcast. So, number one, I don't normally say this, but you are welcome to pause this episode, go away and download the war game, go find 5 hours for you to listen to it. I can assure you, you will be riveted by this. Even if you think of it just as a piece of drama, go listen to it. If you think of it as a piece of drama that talks about where we are today in the world, and there are lots of defense-related people looking very nervous, and again, there are some other interesting things that happen later. But also then just this was a day, and I think you had people like Ben Wallace, Jack Straw and Amber Rudd as examples who probably walked out of that room thinking very different thoughts than they had walking in that room, which shows to me the power of this. So let's go back to what the scenario is for a little bit. The main scenario of the podcast starts with rising tensions between Russia and the UK. And actually, I love this. Normally, you have to sort of set it 5 years away so it doesn't seem real. They actually set it, I think, in October. In other words, they set it last month when we were recording this. And it starts with the discussion about there's an explosion at a Russian naval base that kills dozens of sailors. As it happens, it's not who the Russians are about to accuse, but the Russians accuse the UK of this attack, and it leads to hostilities. Russia then launches a major military exercise in the North Atlantic, and they threaten UK territory. And then the UK government convenes Cobra emergency plan to plan its response. So this is replicating a real world, and they talk about this a number of times through the podcast. This is exactly what the government does to practice. There's a few wavy hands of, obviously, we can't talk about these bits they do, but it's absolutely true.
It's worth just highlighting Cobra for our international listeners is Cabinet Office briefing rooms. So it is the name of the place where the meetings are held. And it is basically any meeting that is deemed high enough in the national interest to require an emergency meeting of a collection of ministers and civil servants and advisors and specialists. So it will quite often be something like a defence issue in this case, or natural disaster.
Natural disaster is a very common one.
Foot and mouth disease, when there was an outbreak of disease within livestock across the UK, it's going to have a significant effect on our economy. They had lots of Cobra meetings.
You probably know this, which will ruin it. I'm hoping you don't, because this will be entertaining for you. Do you know why it's got such a steely name? Like Cobra is a strong name for government coming together in response. Do you know why it's called Cobra?
Only that it's named Cabinet Office briefing rooms.
Cabinet Office briefing room Cobra.
Yeah.
Isn't that fantastic? Everyone's like, well done, Britain. You've come up with an amazing name. No, it's just an acronym for the meeting room we get. Anyway, that's Cobra. Anyway, so I'm going to attempt not to ruin what happens, although it's reasonably self-evident given what I've just said. And actually, it's not what happens, it's how it happens and the results. Across the episodes, the British team faces a series of, and I'm going to say the word high pressure scenarios. And I would imagine that everyone will say here, how high pressure could they be? It was a podcast. It's not real. You know, the Russians aren't going to attack us. Listen to the voices. Listen to the pressure in the room. The point that is made very well here is if you do this war game well, and by the way, there was the war game master who ran it, as you've talked about in the past, ex-British military and has done this before as well. They really take it seriously. So anyone who thinks wargaming or red teaming is a bit Mickey Mouse and a bit fake, go listen to this. And when you hear these professionals who have almost certainly been in Cobra before, you realize that if it's done well, it can be really realistic. And the value of it being realistic is not only everyone engages, but what was so interesting for me was there were unexpected outcomes. Because and we'll talk about this in terms of decision making, in effect, when you've got plenty of time, you're not under pressure, and someone asks you to make a decision, you might pick A. When you don't have a lot of time, when there's a lot going on, or when 3 different situations happen at the same time, as the example here, you may end up picking B. And that is a fabulous conversation afterwards going, well, we always assumed we would do this red teaming exercise. We decided to do that. Was that the right answer, or do we not understand? So that was fantastic. So lots of military operations, cyber attacks, grey zone assaults. So there's lots of discussions about recent history in terms of poisoning, disinformation, and various challenges to national resilience as well. The participants weigh options for retaliation, and there's all sorts of both military, intelligence missions, counter cyber, diplomatic engagement. It's felt pretty real. There were military experts who were playing the Chief of General Staff and a smaller military group of planners.
Yeah, so I think Richard Barron's, wasn't it, playing the
Well, it was
chief,
Richard Barron's,
chief
who
of
is
defence
now.
staff. So he is a retired general, army general, who was a 4-star commander as Joint Force Command, which is now Special Operations and Cyber Command, playing the 4-star Chief of Defence Staff, which is not a role he ever had, in the same way that Ben Wallace is playing
Wasn't the Prime Minister.
Wasn't the Prime Minister. Although, it is foreseeable that he could have been.
The point is, they've got people who know their business.
Who've been inside. I think when you talked about it not being real, but feeling real, the thing to bear in mind is that what is or isn't real about a war game is the actual explosions, the actual planes, the actual ships. If you are a decision maker at the heart of government, you're not going to see a lot of that. So apart from perhaps being rushed into a bunker rather than being, I think they did it in a Whitehall building.
It was I can't remember where it was. They didn't move them.
No.
But they actually, it was really interesting. One of the participants said, "Sir, we need to move you to a safe location."
Yeah.
So they really, without them literally bundling me into a car, that they picked up. But I wanted to pick up the reason why I thought, and you might have been going to say this. As it turns out, there has just been a white paper on the future of the British military that has been written, and I believe General Barron's was the chairman of the group that wrote it. When I followed up afterwards, it was really interesting. He said, I couldn't talk about the document I was writing, but it was so interesting to see some of the scenarios play out that if you now read his document, they will talk about this in terms of air defence and things like that.
The Strategic Defence Review 2025, and as you say, General Barron has chaired the team that pulled it together. Lots and lots of people contributed to it from across defence. But yeah, you're entirely right. But I think it's worth sort of just dwelling on this point for a moment, that when you talk about war games, it can sound a bit, well, the word game itself can often sound trivial, or you do it for fun or frivolity, and there's a seriousness to it, and there's a seriousness that comes through in a well-executed war game, in that if you're running a war game for, I don't know, the C-suite executives of a large company, then the way that you present information to them and the way that they make decisions should be no different to if it was a real life situation. So if you're having a board meeting to discuss the crisis, you do it in the room where you have your board meetings. You have all the right people there. They've prepared in the way that they would for a board meeting. So it is, to all intents and purposes, a real board meeting. And the only thing that's different is that the information that you're talking about isn't. It's a scenario.
Well, there was a point that I think that's worth making there, which is, I suspect to make this really worthwhile, you need to make realistic scenarios.
Yeah.
And we made one up, and it was fine, but it was difficult for people to engage. This was a scenario which literally, as I was listening, there's a particular point I'll talk about in a second in terms of collaboration with other members of NATO.
Yeah.
When they said something quite surprising, and I turned to my son and we all went, yeah, that probably would happen, wouldn't it? And it was really relevant today. We'll come on to that in a second.
And when we used to do command post exercises, which are, to all intents and purposes, war games, we used to put up all the tents that you would put up for a command post, and you would be there with cam cream on, sitting at your fold-out table desk with red lights, looking over a map. It's cold, it's dark, and the information is coming in on either the computer in front of you or over the radio, and it's exactly the same as it is when you're doing real operations, except the person giving you the radio information is not out in an armoured vehicle somewhere. Instead, it's somebody in a room, 200 meters away.
And let's make this about civilian world as well. lots of people were saying, well, if you want to run around in the countryside with cam cream on, well, that's up to you. But I'm not in the military. Let's flip this around. Imagine that you've had a full outage of your SaaS service. And we only have to look at Microsoft, Amazon, and Cloudflare, a number of other organizations where over a relative short period of time, 5 hours, 6 hours, and a catastrophic event happens. And you could imagine how you could role play that kind of event. And it's very close and very realistic. So this isn't just about military. This really is civilian as well.
I did exactly this about 3 months ago with one of the companies I work with. And a professional team of cybersecurity experts ran the scenario. And we were collectively all together, and the CEO of the company was there, all of the different people were there, the MD was there, and we were given the scenario, and then, right, what would you do? What are your actions when this email comes in that this happens? How would you respond? And this wasn't quite the same as us all sitting in, the briefing rooms in the way that we would be dealing with a crisis, because we would, as this company, be all over the place. But we were told, if you're sitting at your desk, how do you deal with this? What would you do? And then what was really interesting is it generated these discussions, and people got very heated, because very, very quickly the scenario melts away, and now you're into, why would you make that decision? Because that leads to this problem. And suddenly it becomes as if it's real, and you start feeling invested.
And I think, again, people listening will say, well, do we believe? Go listen to this podcast and you'll experience it as viscerally. Getting back to this one and almost now shifting away from maybe the value of red teaming and wargaming, just because this was so good. This simulation tested multiple things happening at the same time. And so rather than it's just what would you do if this happened, of course, multiple events happened. And one of the things that they simulated was the UK's reliance on allies. And especially, and this is the bit which I referred to earlier, the reliability of support from the US and other NATO countries. And that was really interesting because it forced the people participating to confront the implications if Britain stood alone. Now, I should say, historically, we have always relied on, and I think it's fair to say, been able to rely on the United States. In fact, and this is a personal opinion, recent US presidents, Mr. Trump specifically, have indicated that Europe has, for want of a better word, benefited from the US investments, and therefore NATO and more broadly Europe have relied on the fact that if something terrible happened, then the United States would back us up. In this scenario, they said, and I'm revealing a piece of it, but I don't think it makes a difference, what would the United States do today? And I think realistically, in the current political climate, it is entirely possible that the United States would fulfill its commitments if a member of NATO, and particularly the United Kingdom, was attacked kinetically, missiles. It's also possible they might say, yeah, we don't like war. America first. Actually, we're here to bring peace about. So rather than defend the United Kingdom, we're going to mediate. So that was fascinating. And just in terms of going back to the reality of this particular war game, when they call up the Americans and the American Secretary of State comes on the line and reveals how America is going to deal with this, you can literally hear it in their voices. Yeah. Oh, shit. And they actually then talk about what they're going to do and how they're going to do it. So I think, to be fair, we haven't talked about the person running the war game, but they did a superb job of also managing these different inputs. And so later on, some of our NATO allies do come to our aid in some way. So, but that was such a good example where if you said to many people, what would happen in this scenario? They would say, well, we'd hold out for this period of time and then America would send its carriers and this is what would happen. So interesting. You put them in this war game scenario and you can almost hear in their voices that they'd never assumed there was ever a possible alternate option.
And I think this is where the scenario itself was so well written, because, and this is the value of war games, of course. At face value, if you say NATO Article 5, if one NATO nation is attacked, then all other NATO nations will come to their aid. It's black and white. It's clear as crystal. This will happen. Not a problem. What was brilliant was the scenario was so ambiguous, and the Russians deliberately played on the ambiguity, created ambiguity, and then some of our allies used that ambiguity as an excuse to not have to tackle the difficult problem. Some of our allies even go as far as to say, we're not even convinced that this is warranting Article 5. This is more tit for tat. We're not going to get involved in this. And there's an element of they are stress testing the British decision-making team. So they are playing out the worst scenario. They're playing it.
Absolutely. And we should be clear. Part of the reason why I think why Sky wanted to do this was they wanted to tell the story of what we could actually do and reveal that information. Done so well. And again, this idea of if you'd have said to people outside of this experience, what would happen? They'd give you one answer. You do it for real, and it's a very different answer. And I have to believe the people participating would have gone out of that and said, okay, if this were to happen, how do we make sure we have more confidence in the answers that we're going to get from people? So it turns out in this case, the Norwegians come to our support. I'm not ruining it for you, by the way. Go listen. You'll still find this incredibly interesting. I would imagine someone will say, okay, we need to go and have conversations with these different countries to say, if in this case this happened, what would you do and how could we guarantee your support? So really, really good. Anyway, they go through this and they talk about, they're very good. They do balance this rather than it's sort of to scare everyone. They talk about these being unlikely but high impact threats.
And I think that's exactly what we should be wargaming.
I think that's well said. In fact, you've said this before.
Yeah, whether you are a company with a turnover of a few million or whether you are a country testing how your nuclear deterrent is going to work, what you should do is think about what is likely to happen and what are the impacts, what is unlikely to happen and what are the impacts, and then really test the balance between impact and likelihood. So things that are high impact but low likelihood, we absolutely need to be thinking about, because those are all our data gets, taken to ransom by cyber attackers, and now we are literally bankrupt. It's the key individual that we are reliant on for the delivery of this multi-million-pound product gets knocked down by a bus. Those things that are very unlikely, but when they happen and you haven't thought about it, are critical. And also the things that are very, very likely that we need to be thinking about all the time. So what are the low impact but very, very likely things that are going to happen? And red teaming and wargaming is particularly good at those high impact, low probability incidents, because those are the things that you can always justify pushing it a little bit further down the line. We'll worry about that, but we'll worry about it tomorrow because we've got today's crisis.
Well, the other thing that they did, which I thought was really, really well done as well, which is from the way we've discussed this, you could get rid of the civilian people and just have this as a military discussion. Absolutely not. So there was a discussion, spoiler alert, there is a missile attack. There was a discussion, how are we going to get the civil authorities to get the right number of fire engines and ambulances there?
Yeah.
And there's this magnificent, I'm using the wrong word here, it's quite the opposite. There used to be a thing in the United Kingdom called the War Book. And the War Book was something that I think was last updated either in the 80s, maybe the 90s. In fact, I'm going to Kew next week. I'm going to go look at the declassified version of one of these war books. But the war book was what would we do in case of war? So I'm imagining, and I'm going to read this myself, there is lots of discussion about what happens to the military. We will disperse our forces. We will call up the reserves, all of that. But more than that, there is also civil defense.
Yeah.
What will local councils do? Local councils will get rid of all people who are non-emergencies from hospitals. We will call in all the off-duty police, whatever it might be. This was actually a holistic view on what would happen in the United Kingdom. That's what the War Book was there for. And by the way, the War Book was almost the tip of the spear, because what happened was then it would go down into the different organizations, and someone at the local police constabulary was told, what will happen? What will you do if this person calls you and says Operation X is go? So that's fascinating. Anyway, this was brought up in the war game when you have the different people from the Home Office saying, Minister, I'm afraid to say we have not practiced this.
Yeah, and this is, again, any major crisis in the UK that the government has to deal with is going to have impacts across various bits of the government, and it's about bringing them together. But again, analogous to a large organisation, we've used this sort of scenario a few times now, but a major cyber attack on an organisation is going to have impacts that reach into every aspect of that business. Unless you wargame it, you might be tempted to think that's an IT issue. That's I'll do my bit by not clicking on links, but that's somebody else's job. In the same way that you might think a hard power attack on the United Kingdom by Russia, well, that's the Ministry of Defence. But of course, yes, it is, but it is also the Department of Trade and Industry, because suddenly all of your ports are now at risk.
Well, you say that there was a Treasury representative, and the Treasury representative, who was brilliantly played, and I think there's a point when he starts arguing with the Prime Minister and the Chief of Defence Staff. The Treasury Minister says, can I just remind you, if we have no economy, we might as well go home. You lot are defending the economy. And it was so interesting. It was this relationship.
Yeah. It's worth thinking about how a war game might bring cross-functional discussions across your organisation in a way that just talking about a scenario around a water cooler wouldn't. And it might dispel some of those preconceived ideas or assumptions about who has responsibility for what. And those low probability, high impact issues, the things that are keeping your CEO awake at night and he or she are hoping never happen, are the things you absolutely need to be talking about today to make sure that you're mitigating the chances of them happening. And if they do, you've got a decent response.
Well, let's take a quick break. When we come back, I just wanted to talk about some of the things that stood out to me as well. And I think you've painted the picture very well. And hopefully it goes back to our red teaming episode where we talked in more detail about it. And then we want to have a bit of fun, if you can have a bit of fun at the end, talking about what they actually talked about.
Yes.
So we'll see you straight after the break. Welcome back. It's always difficult talking about somebody else's podcast. So seriously, if you haven't listened to the podcast yet, apparently you still want to listen to the end of this episode. But once you finish with us, go look for it.
We're probably in the second. We haven't given too many spoilers away.
I've tried very hard not to ruin some of the effects.
Towards the end of the second half of this episode, we're probably going to create a load of spoilers.
I think there'll be a few more spoilers.
If you haven't listened to it and want to, I would suggest doing that before listening.
I think that's well said. Yeah. So some things that stood out to me, which we've kind of covered in the first half, the immersive format, which is everyone took it very seriously.
Yeah.
And I say that because I do worry slightly that if an organisation has never done this before, there's going to be at least 50% of the room going, why am I wasting my 3 hours? Don't you realise I've got work to do? This particular group were highly motivated by this, I suspect, for two reasons. The first one is people were going to hear what they were going to say, so they took it seriously. But perhaps more importantly and less cynically, these were people who arguably had participated in these. So it is immersive. It's got to be immersive. You don't have to lock people in a cellar. But as Gareth said, they did a brilliant job on this. And I think that worked really well. Real world participants, in other words, don't get a bunch of people that are not actually involved. If you're talking about a cyber attack, have your CTO, your head of product, your head of customer, your CEO, your CFO, get the real people involved.
Yeah.
But what was interesting and what they did here was they also had, in inverted commas, other rooms with, as it were, the next level down to be able to feedback. So that was very good.
From a mechanics point of view, which doesn't come out in the podcast, but from my experience of running war games, it's worth considering who the training audience is. Who are you trying to test? Because what you can't really do is test multiple layers of an organization simultaneously.
No.
So what those other rooms effectively become is support acts or enablers to the main test.
You used a word which I was going to say challenge is the wrong word, because I do agree with you, but I don't think it was just a test. I see this as training as well. So this is a group of people who probably have been through these kinds of scenarios before. But one of the things I think works really well is red teaming. It can also be about, we're going to do this 2 or 3 times, not because you're going to come up with different answers, but because it gets easier. So in this particular scenario, there's a very clear process. There's an agenda. And you might go, well, that seems ridiculous. No. There's an agenda, because when people are not under pressure, they've thought about what do we need to talk about and how do we need to do it.
Yeah.
So I think that struck me as, if you need to teach a group of people how to work better together, that's a critical one. And there was a few examples of people not working well together, because this was an unusual group, but I suspect not far from the truth. Brilliant example. So that was good.
I think also with that, and you're entirely right to pick me up on the word test, because training is a far better word. That iterative approach means that you can increase the complexity or the friction over time, building people's resilience up. So when I think back to when we did command post exercises, the first thing we would do is do it at 9 o'clock in the morning when we had a full night's sleep. It was daylight. We weren't.
You slowly make it harder and harder and
we
harder.
weren't in the tents. We weren't, it wasn't freezing cold. We were in a building, and we talked through, these are your roles, and the time pressure would be greatly extended. Then the next time we'd do it a bit quicker. So now you've got 5 minutes to brief, not 10 minutes to brief. What's the key important information? And then you do it in a tent, and you like the ergonomics suddenly all make it really difficult, and everyone's coming in wet because it's raining outside.
Well, I mean, I love it.
Then you do it in the dark.
I love it in the real world, which is the 3 of you in the office. There's a person in Paris and there's a person on holiday.
Yeah.
What are you going to do? So I think that practice, and you mentioned something there which was really interesting, was roles and responsibilities. So they did make this feel real, and you could hear the participants behaving for real. So there's a point at which they discuss the nuclear deterrent, and the Treasury guy starts to argue with the Prime Minister around when they should or shouldn't use the deterrent. Now, at one level, the whole purpose of Cobra is you need to listen to different voices and react. But I caught myself and my son shouting at the radio saying, this is not your role. You are not the decision maker. You need to shut up now. This is the time for the Prime Minister to make a decision. That's a really useful thing in a team when all of a sudden it's like, hey, everyone, this is what our roles are. So if we're all going to argue for 30 minutes, nobody's going to come up with a good answer.
Yeah.
We need to get more disciplined in saying our role is to provide information and advice, and CEO, your job is to make the decision.
Yeah.
Oh, I hadn't kind of worked that out. I was kind of uncomfortable. So this idea of being able to practice not just how you behave and how you work together, but that roles and responsibilities, I thought that was really valuable.
The thing that will come out of this, if you do it well, is the big picture thinking and all the critical decisions and the information that you're going to need to know and all of that kind of stuff. And that's all brilliant and it's really important. And we're going to talk about that in the context of this war game in a moment. But also the really little things, like what information needs to be on the screen? Who needs to be able to see the screen? Where's that information going to come from? Whose job is it to... And this is where, like you say, having an agenda is really important. And by going through the motions, if your company comes under a cyber attack tomorrow, or if there is another global pandemic, or these big, massive, low probability, high impact events that could happen, whatever they are, you probably have a good sense of how you're going to deal with that. What you perhaps haven't thought through is who needs to be in the meeting? How long is that meeting going to be? Who's got the responsibility for pulling that information together to put it onto a slide deck?
I'm going to pick up on what you just said because I think that's brilliant, which is who is going to bring you what information and when? Because we all assume like, well, someone will come to us with a problem. We'll solve the problem. We'll go, no, that's never how it happens.
Yeah.
You need information. I remember one particular time where there was a problem with a system and we needed to continuously go backwards and forwards with the engineering organization to get updates and get answers. Have you discussed that with them? Do they know that's going to be their role? Do they know that when the bat phone goes, pick it up because we need you? So,
and it will always be at 11:30 on a Friday evening when the CEO's just gone on 2 weeks leave.
Yeah, even that, what do you do when he's on leave?
Yeah.
When do you call him back? The other thing as well is I think there'll be people going, we don't have lots of high impact, low probability things. So is this really for us? I think another value of this is you could go team building by building a raft together, or you can put people under pressure together and you can walk away and go, we solved that problem together. Didn't we do a great job? So I think this is also a way of building a stronger team by saying, how do we all behave and how do we all react under pressure?
Yeah.
And by the way, you will also very quickly find out if done well, do you have a member of the team that breaks and starts shouting and gets angry under pressure? Okay, we need to deal with that. So when the real issue comes, so I think the whole point is this is valuable not just in the war game exercise, but it's valuable outside. Anyway.
Yeah, absolutely. And on this podcast, we've in the past talked about the challenges of a coffee shop. I think we used that really early on as an example of where things that go wrong can actually be turned around and be used as opportunities. And I've talked about a red teaming / war game that I did for a very, very small, relatively taxi company that probably saved their business and led to them probably hundreds of thousands, maybe single-digit millions, and also led to them exploiting several opportunities that they wouldn't have seen because of the COVID pandemic. Really small taxi company. So we're not talking nuclear war, but global pandemic. And they asked me for some help very early on, and they said, you kind of think about these kind of things. And I think what they wanted was all the answers, like what's going to happen. And I couldn't give them the answers, but we ran a scenario and we ran towards the pain. We grasped the nettle and we did what's the worst case? What's the highest impact that could happen? And what's the information you need to know? How would you find out? We walked through all of this stuff, and it led to them making some much better decisions as a result. So this doesn't have to be large multinational companies.
I think that's so important.
This could be manager of a coffee shop with a team of 4 or 5.
Yeah.
This could be a taxi company.
What happens if someone slips over?
A couple of million.
What happens if someone slips over in a coffee shop? No, I agree.
Absolutely.
Here was another thing that really struck me, and I've mentioned it a little bit before, which is the way, because they were under pressure, because lots of things were happening at the same time, what was really interesting to me was I could hear in their voices the things in this context felt different than they had imagined. Yeah. So there was a point at which, and I'm probably giving a tiny bit of, it almost doesn't matter if I told you the script, go listen to it, it's so good. there is a point at which we need to have air defense for the United Kingdom. And it is revealed, not revealed as in it was a secret, it's known, that we do not have any air defense to speak of in the United Kingdom. We do. It is F-35s or Typhoon aircraft that are on combat air patrols, or we have Type 45 destroyers, which are world-beating. A Type 45 destroyer parked in London can see what's going on over Poland, kind of a thing. Anyway, so there's a discussion. There's going to be an attack. What are we going to do?
It's worth just, again, because to non-military geek listeners, they might have thought you've massively contradicted yourself there, in that you said, we haven't got any air defence, and then we've got these Type 45s that can see from London to Poland. Type 45 is a warship and was designed, and it has been designed, to deploy to go and do air defence in war zones overseas. So the only reason that it would protect the UK is if we happen to have them nearby.
Well, and there's a limit to what it can do. Yeah. There's a fantastic moment when the Chief of Defence Staff says, we have one at sea. And the Treasurer says, we've paid for 6. Why is there only one available? Which is a really, hang on a minute. Why are we having this conversation in this war game? You should know this, right? And then the Chief of Defence Staff says, because you've nickeled and dimed us and 4 of them are under repair at any one time because you won't fund them. Really good example of how it became very real.
Yeah,
they were genuinely arguing about the Treasury and how much money was spent. But you could tell the context was such that the answers changed. Yeah. And actually, I would hope that someone from the Treasury would walk out of the room and go, maybe we need to think about this. If we've only got 6 of these Type 45s, maybe only having one available to actually fight at any one time is a bad idea. So that was really interesting to me, which was under pressure. And when you got to play with the circumstances in a very realistic way, you were listening to people on the podcast go, no, that can't be right. People going, no, it is. You just didn't ever ask. So you learn lots of new stuff as well. Practice, process, and lessons we've talked about. And I there's a phrase that my family hate, which is Übung macht perfekt, which is what my uncle, who is a German, he was a ski instructor, taught me, which is German for practice makes perfect. Do this a couple of times, and I bet you get some much better outcomes. The final thing I'll say about this was, while we listened to it over 5 hours, this was recorded in one day, in one session. And as I said to you, Ben Wallace makes a very clear statement about everything is happening too fast. This feels like the real world, where in this particular scenario, and it was not unrealistic, it really wasn't unrealistic, you could tell, if you just give me one thing to think about, we can all have a chat about it and we can deal with it, even really serious things. Give me 3 things. And there was a point at which he says, I can't do that now. Shut up. I need to go and do this thing. And it felt, when you're under that time pressure, again, it's very, very different.
And what's a useful dynamic in a war game is that you don't just have a scenario and go, right, how would you solve this problem? What happens is there are what we call injects or updates.
Yeah.
And constantly throughout the decision making, throughout the discussion, throughout the actions that you're taking, there are bits of information coming in about change. And some of that is as a result of the decisions you've made, and some of it isn't. So there was quite a lot in this war game where people in the team, so Ben Wallace as the Prime Minister, is talking about what the UK's response is going to be, and then it would cut away to the Russians talking about what they're going to do next. And as the audience, you can see that there's a divergence between what the UK team are expecting and what's about to happen, and you have this sneaky feeling that they're about to get undermined, and then it happens.
But there's a beautiful bit which was also for me a really good reminder, which is you don't know what the opposition is doing.
No.
And in this particular case, there was a point at which one side assumed the other side was doing something.
Yeah.
And it turns out they weren't doing something, which I think is another really good example of when you talked about risks in the first half.
Yeah.
And that's another interesting point as well to practice, which is the information you have may not be accurate or correct.
Yes. Yeah.
And by the way, if that, again, maybe I'm putting myself in the audience incorrectly, there are times when I would say, well, but that would never happen because, something as important as this, you would be sure about the other's intentions. Here's one of my favorite Cold War stories is the fact that we very nearly went to war in 1981, I think it was, with Operation or Exercise Able Archer.
83.
83?
Yeah.
See, look at that. He knows. Actually, I would imagine you've talked about this a lot in the military. And the reason why I say it was every year, NATO came together to do an exercise, both to practice interoperability, but also to demonstrate resolve. We thought we were doing a good thing and showing resolve and practicing. What we didn't understand was the Russians were pretty sure we were about to attack them, partly because that's how Russians typically do it. They get an exercise and they don't finish it. But that was a brilliant example of the whole of Europe and the US was focused on understanding what the Russians were doing, and they got it wrong. And it was only for various interesting reasons that we found out that the Russians thought we were going to go to war, and we stopped it. So if you take it back here,
I think actually the exercise just came to an end.
We stopped it early. We stopped it early, and we telegraphed that we would de-escalating. It was Oleg Gordievsky, who was a spy for MI6, who said that Russians think you're going to invade. And it was at this point where the Russians were watching the Ministry of Defense to see if there were more lights on at night. Because there seems so anyway, but the point here is the information we have to hand. That's another really good one to say, do we really know what's going on?
Yeah.
If you go back to that cyber attack, we think X is happening.
Yeah.
We think it's X person doing it. I myself have been in a case where we thought it was an external actor or an accident, and it turned out it was an internal actor.
Yeah, and that gives you a really good opportunity to not only talk about what you would do when presented with information, but also learn about things like heuristics and bias, groupthink, but also about your information feeds and the validity and the veracity of the information you have. So whether you're a government who've got all of the levers of the intelligence apparatus, or whether you're a company that relies on reading the newspapers and paying subscriptions and getting data feeds from wherever and whatever, actually testing those, testing what you actually know at any given time and what you assume you know is a really healthy thing to do.
So at this point, I'm going to draw a line and say, I think we've just about over-egged this pie. Go download the war game. It is riveting. I mean, we almost were sad when it was over because it was both terrifying, exciting, entertaining, and informing. Go listen to the war game. Just in the last few minutes, and maybe this is more for my fun and Gareth's fun, one of the reasons I think why they made this was to demonstrate that the British military is not the British military of the 1970s and 1980s. Back in the 1970s and 80s, we were a well-invested military. We were a large standing military. We had comprehensive plans for if should anything happen. We had lots of people on backup. And we took the peace dividend after the fall of the Berlin Wall. And by the way, honestly, I can't blame it. Can't blame the country because we've spent it on education, NHS.
Absolutely. And as a pro-defense former military person, I find it deeply frustrating, but also
understandable.
Absolutely understandable.
And that's the challenge. So the general point they were making was there's a brilliant bit where Ben Wallace says, launch the air defense. And the Chief of General Staff says, well, you can cover 2 places with our air defense with the aircraft we have today. Where do you want to put them, Prime Minister?
Yeah.
What do you mean, where? Well, We're going to put them here because of strategic reason. We'll put them over London. In the end, we're not going to put them over. That was fascinating. And I thought what was interesting for me was that I think the British military and the British government today has a very, very difficult situation.
Yeah, and I think also worth recognising that the decisions to not invest in more Typhoons or better air defence or, they're not made out of ignorance. They have made these kind of war games happen all of the time. And governments have this really difficult challenge of we can spend money on hospitals, we can spend money on policing, we can spend money on aircraft carriers or missiles, we can spend money on repairing potholes. Where do you want to?
I agree, and I think that I'll put what you've just said in a slightly different way. We can spend money on something that we need in the house today, or we could spend it on insurance.
Yeah.
And by the way, you don't have to buy insurance. This is not like your car.
Yeah.
You could insure yourself if you wanted to.
And I think what's really important to recognise is that something like insurance is an intangible thing.
That's the thing about the military is until you need them, why would you want to keep them?
And so how do you make something intangible tangible? You war game the worst case scenario.
Well, but the other thing that struck me as well, which was why I think governments come in for an awful lot of stick. And in this particular case, I think, unfortunately, they're in a difficult position. The first thing is education. So let me be clear. I'm pretty sure in general terms, members of the government understand how terribly wrong this stuff can go. Right now, the Minister of Defence knows what we could do in a situation like this and would say, Prime Minister, it's not what you think we're going to be able to do. But the problem is, this is a democracy. The problem is this is a democracy. We should all be in China or United States at the moment, possibly, where actually people have to get voted in. So I would argue the chief reason why we would not invest in the military is because I don't know in this particular case, in this real world scenario, the electorate actually understands what that means. There's a second piece as well, which is that perhaps sounds like I'm saying, well, the general populace is stupid. It doesn't realize how dangerous this is. That's not what I'm trying to say. Actually, there's a second piece which almost gets back to this decision making, which is back in the 1980s and for the last arguably 50 years, it's obviously not 50 years, but 40 years, the peace dividend has been well spent, as in we haven't needed that military, arguably, in that life or death situation. The challenge comes is at what point does the government say to an educated populace, by the way, I'm afraid we're going to close 20 hospitals.
Yeah.
We're going to cut police forces and we're going to do these other things because we now need to invest in the military. Knowing when that time is going to happen, that's really difficult. Because right now, if the politicians said of any party, potentially some populists out there who would understand, we're going to invest, I'm going to make this up, 5% in GDP with a bump to get us started, I think that would be political suicide today, because all the people who say we love our military also love their pension being triple locked.
Yeah.
Also love their potholes being filled. And I think so there's a real tricky thing for our governments today about how to educate people, how to inform people, and when to make these kinds of decisions.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's no coincidence that Sky have decided to produce a podcast that exposes some of the gaps in our defence capability now, because this is one of those situations when we need to start thinking about whether we need to rebalance, because the world has changed for two major reasons. There's probably more, but the two I can think of at the moment is we now have a situation where our most reliable and dependable and generous ally, the United States, is looking a little bit less reliable, less dependable,
let's say that
and a
very
little
clearly.
less generous.
If something catastrophic happened, it is not clear the United States would come to the defence of the United Kingdom or any other NATO ally. Now, I'm sure there'll be lots of people who wave their hands and say, you don't understand. Personal opinion, I would not take that bet at this point.
I think the fact that we're even having that discussion
Exactly. That's
is an argument to say
it's a non-zero.
Should we be reinvesting in defence? And the second one is the war in Ukraine. And actually, I would argue that started in 2014. And so we should have started this conversation a while ago. But then I have a particular bias. But the war in Ukraine has highlighted that these very, very large scale conflicts are still a reality. Fukuyama's The End of History didn't
you've
really
said it
happen.
already very well. It's intangible.
Yeah.
Honestly, the conflict in Ukraine is that thing that happened on TV. The conflict in Ukraine is that nice family that have moved into the village.
Yeah.
But it's not going to happen to us because that's hundreds of miles away. This particular podcast, a war game, yes, well, that would never happen. Because I think it's the intangibilities that are difficult. Just before we finish, because we're coming to the end and I know we're doing having a bit of sort of a chat about this, I thought it was a really great conversation about the nuclear deterrent in this one.
Yeah.
So I would imagine most people listening to this understand the value of the nuclear deterrent. And it was really important in this conversation because arguably one of the reasons why the United Kingdom and frankly other members of NATO have felt confident in decreasing their investment in conventional weapons and conventional armies is that there is a backstop, which is the nuclear deterrent, which says, should we ever have an existential threat to our country, we have the nuclear deterrent that says, if you want to attack us, you have to be confident that we're not going to nuke your country.
Yeah.
And I think, I don't know whether people agree with me, I would argue it has been incredibly successful over the last however many years we've had the nuclear deterrent.
Well, no nuclear weapons have been used in combat since the 2 nuclear weapons.
So you would say that's fine
in Japan. So I would say arguably it has worked up until this point.
Now, listening to the war game, there was obviously discussion about the Russians in this scenario or attacking us. Should we use the nuclear deterrent? Which, by the way, go listen to it. There's a fabulous bit where the Treasury guy starts getting a bit shitty, and I'll leave you to discover the shittiness. But what was really interesting, and I had never considered, which again, I guess going back to the value of wargaming, is Ben Wallace's point was when he needed to get the cooperation of our allies, one of the arguments he was using was, you don't want us to launch a nuclear weapon. So this is not you're our enemy, so therefore we are going to fire a nuclear weapon at you. Actually, what he was saying was we would use the nuclear deterrent with our allies to say, you don't want us backed up against a wall. And I thought, I had never considered that as a use case for the nuclear deterrent. Clearly, we've all thought about how do you tell your adversary you don't want to go there. I thought that was really fascinating from a nuclear deterrent perspective. But again, I actually thought, I suspect Ben Wallace has thought about this, but wasn't that interesting that it was the scenario that played out in the war game which made them go, crap, how do we get our allies to step up?
Yeah.
At which point, whether it was original thinking or not, we should use the nuclear deterrent with our allies to say, you don't want us to fire a nuclear weapon at the Russians because this is bad for all of us.
Yeah, you need to help us, otherwise we have no choice.
Yeah.
I think the nuclear deterrence is a really complex and interesting topic in its own right because it's never really been tested for real because we've never been in a situation where actual combat has involved nuclear weapons where both sides have had them. So it's always been theoretical, but it's based largely on things like our understanding of game theory.
Yeah.
So multiplayer, and game theory is a branch of statistical mathematics looking at how multiplayer rational decision makers will make decisions based on access to information. It's a whole field of maths. It's really interesting, but we're not going to talk about it now.
But it was,
But I think the prisoner's dilemma is perhaps the most accessible and well-known bit, which
Yeah,
is
but
this idea of I have to second guess what other people are going to do.
it struck me that the now we're into sort of the philosophy of nuclear deterrence. It strikes me that a nuclear deterrent is at its most valuable and effective before there is a point of escalation.
Yeah, arguably.
When you get to that point of escalation, it absolutely has value, but it becomes riskier. And the reason the again, I'll use this particular war game again. We warned you about spoilers. Ben Wallace says in this war game, I'm not going to launch the nuclear deterrent at the Russians. And someone says to him, well, if you're not going to launch it, why the bloody hell do we build it? And I think the point is, no. What he was saying was, we have not yet reached a point where literally it is an existential threat where there will be no United Kingdom. And so therefore it was a different conversation. But you could tell there was this point where there is a group of people that says if you have a nuclear deterrent, you should absolutely be ready to use it. That's fine. But when should you be ready to use it?
Yeah.
Really interesting
And
as
again,
a decision making and a thinking about it. And again, the war game I thought was brilliant. I think that helps articulate when would we use it? And when would we not use it? Can we think of examples where we would say, well, hang on a minute.
Well, deterrent is nuclear deterrence, but deterrence generally has this paradoxical dilemma of it relies on you understanding what other people understand about you. So there is an incentive for transparency. And that's why during the Cold War, the Soviets and the Americans and us came up with the Open Skies Treaty, which is we want you to know some things about our capabilities because we want you to be deterred by them. And then there is this other aspect that makes it paradoxical because what you also need to do is have absolute confidence in your own capability, and therefore you want to protect the things that make it vulnerable. So the highest levels of classification, the most important secrets, are often things about nuclear capabilities, because what you don't want is somebody to know how to turn the switch off to make it not work. So you end up with this situation where your decisions are based on your understanding of what the adversary understands, what you understand about the adversary's capability, your confidence in your countermeasures.
This is all complicated.
And your confidence in your own capability.
I can see massive opportunity for it going wrong when you get one or more of those wrong.
In the world of the Cold War, that was complicated enough because it was the West, NATO, and the Soviets. Now we're in a multi-actor situation where you've got the Soviet, the Russians, the Chinese, the British, the French, the Americans. Now, the British, French, and Americans, you could argue, are going to be broadly similar in their outlook. You've got the Indians and the Pakistanis. You've got the North Koreans. And this is why, not least, we don't want just more nuclear weapons, because the more weapons there are, the more likelihood there is of accidents, miscalculations, or just them being used. But this is also why we don't want proliferation of nuclear capabilities to other nations, because it makes the game harder the more actors that are in it.
I learned a lot more about Oleg Gordievsky, and he has we believe, unique experience in that at a very, very important Cold War meeting, he briefed both the leader of Russia and the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. And the reason why he was proud of doing that as a spy for MI6 was he realized it was misunderstanding that often caused the most problems. After that, I think it was someone in the UK government joked, maybe we should just send the Russians our cabinet meeting notes. But you smiled when I said that, but the point was exactly that. Let's make sure we understand ourselves.
Yeah.
Because wouldn't that be embarrassing if we all died because you thought we were going to do X when we were going to do Y, or you misunderstood what that meant.
Yeah.
Again,
Yeah.
there was another piece of history I was listening to Korea. In the Korean War, General MacArthur did not think the Chinese would become involved in the Korean War. He
Until they did.
entirely misunderstood that the Chinese said the idea of having American troops on our border is unacceptable.
Yeah.
And they actually telegraphed this directly through the Indians to the US government. The US government ignored it. They thought, that's nonsense. Anyway.
So I think to bring this to a close and to sort of round off the discussion about nuclear weapons, have you seen the film House of Dynamite?
Oh, this is a new film, isn't it?
Yeah.
I have not seen it.
Okay.
Is it sad? Am I going to be disappointed at the end or not sleep?
Well, I think we've spoiled the podcast War Game for anyone that's still listening to us now and hasn't listened to it. So what I'm not going to do is I'm not going to spoil the film House of Dynamite. But in terms of looking at the challenge of decision making and high pressure decision making at its most profound and consequential is perhaps nuclear decisions when looking at nuclear deterrence. House of Dynamite explores that challenge extremely well, and a lot of the things we've talked about are explored in the film. And I think just bringing it back to War Games, what I think is quite interesting is how much we use fictional narratives,
to play through things,
books, to play through things and spark ideas. And you'd be quite surprised, I suspect, Chris, you wouldn't, but people would be quite surprised at how much an fictional narrative written by a science fiction writer or a spy novelist or whatever has influenced national security policy, or has got people to come into work having watched it the night before and said, you know, that film,
what would we do?
What would we do? And then suddenly there's a war game running and there's some changes to policy. So as another recommend, go and watch the film House of Dynamite, but watch it with the mindset of red teaming and thinking about...
look at that. You can't stop it, can you? Rather than go watch a film and enjoy it, you think about red teaming.
Or...
I'm going to let you off. No, I'm going to take an exec decision. You can just watch the film and enjoy it.
Open a bottle of wine, don't worry about it.
You've heard enough about red teaming. Well, look, on that, get this. Bombshell, he said, both stealing from someone else, but also using an appropriate term. We'll finish off for today. I know I've raved about it. It's difficult to get me to just not talk for 5 hours, listen to something, be both excited, terrified. If you haven't, please do listen to War Game. Listen to the first episode. You'll get into it. But also House of Dynamite, that sounds good. I didn't realise we've just changed into a podcast and film review podcast.
Yeah.
But that's close enough. I hope you've enjoyed that. It was a little bit different. We obviously have a red teaming episode. If you go back into our notes, I can't remember which one it was, but it was a couple of months ago we did it. So do go back and listen to that, where we go into a bit more detail about how you can do it and some scenarios. Thank you for joining us. I'm going to remind everyone, by the way, that we're on the run-up to Christmas now. There you go. I needed to end this on a slightly upbeat
I think you've gone
note.
too early. I mean,
Have I gone
mid-November.
Seriously, we were talking about nuclear destruction and about the Russians attacking us. Let me off on going early on Christmas. We'll hold off publishing this as close as we can till Christmas, but frankly, it will fail. It'll still be November when we publish this, I bet. If you have any better movies or different movies that we should review. Sorry, I'm getting very confused about what the purpose of the podcast is. Let us know. We're on battlingwithbusiness@gmail.com. We are also on Twitter and on Blue Sky. I forgot for a second. I'm battling with biz with a Z. So let us know. Genuinely email us. We love to get your feedback and hear what's going on.
Battlingwithbusiness@gmail.com.
Yes, that's absolutely right. Download, subscribe, all those usual things that we tell you to do. But I think I've run out of steam, as you can tell. There was a bit of coughing today. I apologise for that. And obviously I'm not...
Like and subscribe. Tell your friends.
Tell your friends. That's all good. I think that's about it for the day. Let's not call it a day. Let's go open a bottle of wine and go relax for the rest of the evening. Thank you for joining us. We will see you next week on Battling with Business.
Wonderful. Cheerio.